Welcome, everybody. And this talk is on what became of the various Confederate leaders after the fall of Richmond. So Sunday, April 2nd, 1865 is when Richmond was evacuated. Jefferson Davis was in St. Paul's when he received a telegram from Lee. And this was not the first telegram that he had received that morning. This was actually the third one. But this is the one that prompted action and caused Davis to realize that, yes, the capital had to be evacuated. So by a little before midnight that night, Jefferson Davis and members of the cabinet were on one of the last trains out of the city. So what I want to do is talk about the men who were fleeing Richmond with Jefferson Davis and a couple of others. In the cabinet, there were three men that had served with Davis throughout the entire war. One of those was Judah Benjamin. He was regarded as Jefferson Davis's most important advisor, most trusted advisor. One historian called him the brains of the Confederacy. And there was a lot to set Benjamin apart. For one thing, he was a Sephardic Jew, a Jew of Spanish descent. He had been born in the British West Indies and possessed very much of a cosmopolitan charm. Grew up in Charleston, but then moved to New Orleans to study law, and there married a woman from a prestigious Creole family, Natalie Saint Martin. After the birth of a daughter, however, she ended up taking the child and going to Paris, and Benjamin then throughout the rest of his life would make these annual visits. That certainly caused some gossip, and today historians speculate that he may have been a homosexual. So the marriage, though, did give Benjamin the social status that he needed there in New Orleans, and his career prospered due to his keen mind. Benjamin, in fact, wrote a law text that became the standard in Louisiana. He also became a planter and found new ways of growing and processing sugarcane. Served in the Louisiana state legislature, and then in 1852 is when he won election to the U.S. Senate. So that's where Benjamin first came in contact with Jefferson Davis. And they didn't get off on the best footing. In a debate on the Senate floor, Davis evidently made a sneering remark to Benjamin, and Benjamin challenged Jefferson Davis to a duel. And in in an extremely rare occasion, Jefferson Davis apologized to Judah Benjamin, and then the two men developed a relationship. So when Davis becomes a provisional president, he names Benjamin Attorney General because of his expertise in the law. When there's an opening in the War Department, he shifts Benjamin over there. Now, as Secretary of War, Benjamin ran into a lot of issues with various generals. He was extremely unpopular. Stonewall Jackson almost resigned as a result of Benjamin. So Congress called for Judah Benjamin's resignation. And it just so happened that there was an opening in the State Department at the time. So Benjamin became Secretary of State, and that's where he serves throughout most of the war. Benjamin was an interesting person. He enjoyed fine food and clothes, was a serious gambler, was known for his entertaining wit, jovial manner, and perpetual smile. And he seems to possess this same sort of manner as they're evacuating Richmond and on this train ride to Danville, Virginia. Also in the cabinet throughout the war was Stephen Mallory. Mallory served as Secretary of the Navy. He had been born in the British West Indies as well, born in Trinidad, but spent his childhood in Key West, Florida. Mallory studied law and became a county judge and collector of the port at Key West. And he too married well. He married Angela Sylvia Moreno, who came from a prominent Spanish family. And it was in 1850 that Mallory was elected to serve in the U.S. Senate, where he chaired the Naval Affairs Committee. So hence this appointment here in the Confederate government. Mallory realized that there was no way the South was ever going to be able to compete with the North as far as shipbuilding went. But he knew that they could at least make some headway through innovation. So he encouraged the building and acquisition of ironclad ships, the development of torpedoes, what we know today as underwater mines, also the use of torpedo boats and submarines. And the third man to be with Davis throughout the entire war was John Reagan. Reagan served as the Postmaster General. We think of Reagan as a Texan because that's where he spent most of his years. Although he was born in Tennessee, he moved to Texas in his 20s. He was a rather rough and rugged sort of guy. He was a farmer, an attorney, a judge, and a two-term U.S. congressman. And Reagan, in serving in Congress, realized that the North and South were not going to be able to patch up their differences. So he actually resigned his seat in the U.S. Congress before Texas seceded. He did that in January of 1861, and then when Texas does finally secede, Reagan is named as a delegate to the Provisional Congress. And he arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, where the Congress met to form the government, before, or he arrived too late to actually vote for Jefferson Davis as president, but he did arrive in time to accept this appointment. And Reagan, again, he had been on the Postal Committee in the U.S. Congress, so he has a little bit of background. He was faced with a very challenging task, however, because the Confederate Constitution required that the post office pay its own way. So in order to do this, Reagan cut staff, he reduced the number of deliveries and the number of mail routes, and he got the railroads to agree to cut their rates by 50% so that mail would go by rail rather than by road. Now, these cutbacks caused an outcry. There were people not very happy with these things. So Reagan thought about resigning, but Davis encouraged him to stay in the cabinet. He did. And because of his efforts, the Confederate Postal Department is the only one in American history that has actually made a profit. Now, the other men in the cabinet were relative newcomers, and I apologize for the picture here of George Trenholm. It's not very good, but I did want to use it because this is a picture that we have in our collection. Trenholm was the Secretary of Treasury for only 9 months, but did his best to make an impact, I'll say, and had really been an behind-the-scenes advisor throughout the term of Christopher G. Memminger, who was the first Secretary of Treasury. Trenholm was very successful. He came from Charleston, South Carolina. He had initially started work in a shipping firm and then ended up owning a few firms as well as a plantation, wharves, warehouses, numerous ships. And between 1852 and 1856, Trenholm had served in the state legislature. He did a lot to aid the Confederacy financially early on. He had a gunboat built for South Carolina and used his fleet of 50 merchant vessels to import military items and items of civilian necessity. He also, when he did become Secretary of Treasury, by that point the government owed $360 million in back pay to the Army. And he did his best to pay off the troops by selling off government coin and cotton and by putting up $200,000 of his own money. And we have George Davis, who was only in the cabinet for a couple of months, served as Attorney General. Davis came from North Carolina. He was a lawyer. In fact, he had been general counsel of the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad before the war, and was quite the unionist. In fact, in the election of 1860, he supported the Constitutional Union Party, and he was also a member of the failed Washington Peace Conference in February of 1861. But in spite of those efforts, when North Carolina seceded, Davis went along with his state and served as a delegate to the Provisional Congress, and then served 2 terms in the Congress after the government was up and running. And it was when he failed to be reelected to that 3rd term that Davis made him Attorney General. And then last, but certainly not least, we have John C. Breckinridge, who became Secretary of War. And of Davis's secretaries of war, Breckinridge is really the only one that has any kind of leeway to do what he wants, any kind of influence over Davis. Of course, Breckinridge had a great background. He came from a well-known political family in Kentucky. He, interestingly enough, was a cousin of Mary Todd Lincoln. He had served in the Mexican War as a major of a Kentucky infantry regiment, began his political career in 1849 when he was elected to the State House of Representatives, then went to Congress in 1851, and in 1856, Breckinridge was nominated to serve as James Buchanan's running mate. And when Buchanan won election, Breckinridge, at the age of 36, became the youngest vice president in American history. He was nominated by the Southern Democrats in the election of 1860. So remember, in that election, the Democrat Party had split. This is also part of what leads to Lincoln's election. Breckinridge, as the vice president, was also president of the Senate. So it was his duty to count those electoral votes and proclaim Abraham Lincoln the winner of the election. And then he took his seat in the Senate, for which he had been elected. As a senator from Kentucky, Breckinridge spoke out against Abraham Lincoln's use of force to put down the rebellion, and he urged Kentucky to remain neutral. But then Confederate forces ended up marching into Kentucky, and Kentucky declared itself for the Union. So this put Breckinridge in a bit of an uncomfortable position. There was actually a warrant issued for his arrest. So at that point, he fled south, becomes a brigadier general, and then finally Secretary of War. And he is named War Secretary really at a time when it's kind of obvious that the Confederacy is on its deathbed. So one thing that Breckinridge did was to work about bringing what he termed an honorable defeat. And I will take a moment to mention that a lot of my information for this talk comes from William C. Davis's book, An Honorable Defeat, which is excellent. I highly recommend it. But he goes into a great deal of detail about Breckinridge's efforts. Breckinridge said, "The Confederacy should not be captured in fragments. We should not disband like banditti, but we should surrender as a government." He declared, "This has been a magnificent epic. In God's name, let it not terminate in a farce." Breckinridge, although a member of the cabinet, was not on that train leaving Richmond. He stayed behind in an effort to get supplies to Robert E. Lee. And then one other member of the government not on the train, Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president. Stephens was a frail, sickly man who stood under 5'7" and weighed less than 100 pounds, probably more close to 80 or something. He did possess, though, a very great intellect, and of course had been involved in politics since the 1830s. Stevens, before the war, really had worked to prevent secession. He was very much opposed to secession. He kept thinking that Congress would be able to work something out. But like Davis, when his state seceded, he went along with his states. Now, Alexander Stephens was a strong adherent to the doctrine of states' rights, and clashed with Jefferson Davis when Davis began to exercise more and more federal power. So Stephens didn't spend a lot of time in Richmond during the war. He ended up going back to his home in Crawfordville, Georgia. But during the last year of the war, he did pour a great deal of effort in trying to bring about a peace agreement, hence the Hampton Roads Peace Conference. So these are the guys that we're kind of looking at. Now, after the government left Richmond, that train went to Danville, Virginia. They spent about a week there. Danville became the third capital of the Confederacy. And then after they received news of Robert E. Lee's surrender, the government heads further south down through North Carolina. They reach Charlotte or in Charlotte on April 23rd, when Davis holds the last cabinet meeting that has everyone in attendance there. And by this point, General Joseph Johnston had entered into surrender negotiations with General Sherman. Despite Jefferson Davis's wishes, the entire cabinet voted in favor of surrender. And during these discussions, what's on the table is not only the surrender of Johnston's army, but of all the Confederate armies. Now, when that agreement goes to Washington, Washington did not like the agreement and insisted that Sherman only offer terms for Johnston's army, and also indicate that his terms had been way too generous. So the negotiations, even though they start on the 23rd, the surrender doesn't come until later. April 26th, government is outside of Charlotte at Fort Mill, and this is when the first cabinet members resign. Both Davis and Trenholm resigned on that day, and then as they proceed further south, May 3rd, Mallory and Judah Benjamin both resign. Jefferson Davis, however, still has hopes of carrying on the struggle and actually winning the fight. But finally, on May 4th in Washington, Georgia, he is forced to disband the government. And he temporarily disbanded the government because Davis still had hopes that at some point they could come back together again. This is not to be, though. May 10th, Jefferson Davis was captured outside of Irwinville, Georgia. By that point, he had joined back up with his wife, Verena, and their children. And John Reagan is the only member of the cabinet riding with Davis. So he is captured on this morning, along with Davis's aides, William Preston Johnston and Colonel Francis Lubbock, and his secretary, Colonel Burton Harrison. The camp had been surprised early that morning by Colonel Benjamin Pritchard of the 4th Michigan Cavalry. Davis, in an attempt to escape, as he left his tent, picked up a rain cape or a raglan that he thought was his, turned out to be his wife's. So you saw pictures like this throughout the North. And the situation was made a bit worse, too, by Verena, because as Davis left the tent, she threw a shawl over his head, and in an effort to disguise him, also sent a servant with him carrying a bucket of water. And when one of the troopers said, "Who's that headed off toward the woods?" she said, "That's my mother." So needless to say, this was humiliating to Jefferson Davis. The party was then taken to the headquarters of General Wilson in Macon, Georgia. From there, they were sent by train to Savannah and then by boat to Fort Monroe, which is where Jefferson Davis was imprisoned. Verena and the children were taken back to Savannah, where she was held basically under house arrest. She was not allowed to visit Jefferson Davis for an entire year. Neither was she allowed to communicate with him. Now, Reagan was taken to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, where he was imprisoned along with Alexander Stephens. Stephens had been arrested on May 11th, and he made no attempt to escape. He just stayed at his home there and then was brought in. Soon others were captured. Mallory, who had left the cabinet on May 3rd, was captured on the 20th and taken to Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. Trenholm, who had resigned on April 26th, the very first to resign, and mainly he resigned because he was very ill, too ill to travel. So he didn't try to escape either. He went to his home outside Columbia, South Carolina, and then was arrested and imprisoned at Fort Pulaski outside of Savannah. Now, Benjamin and Breckinridge managed to escape. Benjamin, of course, ever resourceful, assumed the identity of a Frenchman, Monsieur Bonpland, and disguised himself with a cape and with some goggles, set off in a buggy. And his story is just one of these fantastic stories that I guess I'm not sure whether to believe it or not, but it's incredible. So as he travels, he makes his way down into Florida, decides to change his disguise, becomes a South Carolina farmer looking for land. And evidently at one point he got to a fork in the road, wasn't quite sure which way he should go, so decided to just lay down and take a nap, and was helped by a parrot. He was awakened by cries of, "Hi for Jeff." And he, thinking that the only Jeff in the South was Jeff Davis, he assumed that the parrot belonged to a Confederate sympathizer. So he followed the parrot home. The parrot did belong to a Confederate, and so that Confederate was able to offer him assistance. So Benjamin was eventually able to get a boat to the Bahamas, and then and actually that trip to Bimini took 17 days because of storms. So he had his difficulties, and then he is finally able to reach Cuba. But he did have some trouble with transportation. In fact, when he tried to leave the Bahamas, the first boat that he boarded was a boat that was carrying sponges. And water leaked into the hold, the sponges expanded, broke the ship apart. Then he got on another ship, and that one ended up catching fire. So it's just amazing, and if you want to read more about this, William C. Davis in Honorable Defeat goes into great detail on Benjamin's escape. And I was able to find out that at least the furthest back account that I could find of the account of the parrot helping Benjamin was in an 1890 issue of United Service, a monthly review of military and naval affairs. And according to that source, this was told in the halls of Congress by someone who had heard it from a Confederate soldier who heard it from Benjamin. Benjamin, after reaching Cuba, then sailed for England and arrived in England by August 20th, where he studied British law, was called to the bar after only 5 months, and wrote a classic treatise on commercial law in England. In fact, it's known as Benjamin on Sales. It is still used today. And when Benjamin retired in 1883, he was one of the highest paid lawyers of his time. Now with Breckinridge, of course, he had two main goals. That first goal was to bring about the honorable defeat, to do what he could for that. And after he had expended his efforts with those negotiations between Sherman and Johnston, then he focused on this second goal of trying to make sure Jefferson Davis reached safety. So what Breckinridge did and why he was not with Davis when Davis was captured is he set out with a small party of men on a separate route. They were traveling the same direction, but on different roads. And the hope was that this party and Breckinridge would be a decoy and lead the Union troops away from Davis. Of course, that didn't work. And when Breckinridge reached Milltown on May 14th, he heard that Jefferson Davis had been captured. So at that point, Breckinridge was able to focus on his own escape. He too goes down through Florida, hides out in the swamplands, and eventually gets a boat and winds up in Cuba. And after about a month of enduring mosquitoes, rainstorms, Yankees, ruffians, and dehydration, he arrived in Cuba on June 11th. And again, if you want to read about Breckinridge's escape, which is just fascinating as well, it's in Honorable Defeat. But he arrived in Cuba and then made his way over to England, did what he could to kind of tie up or settle Confederate financial affairs, and then went back to Canada, where he spends time in exile there. George Davis came very close to escaping. After he resigned on April 26th, he made some arrangements for his children and then headed through the Carolinas and into Florida. And he spends a considerable amount of time hiding out in Florida, actually several months, and then makes an attempt to sail for Nassau in the Bahamas. But he encounters the same storm that Benjamin had encountered and actually spends 33 days at sea only to wind up in Key West. Now, by that point, it was October 18th. And George Davis learned that Alexander Stephens, Trenholm, and Reagan had all been captured and released. So he decided that a few months in prison was preferable to what he had been dealing with in these swamps and storms. So he turned himself in and was actually out by January 1st. In fact, of the cabinet, Stephen Mallory was the only one who remained in prison. And Mallory was not released until March of 1866. He served the longest prison term of anyone with the exception of Jefferson Davis. And the reason for this is, as Secretary of the Navy, Mallory was considered responsible for the privateering activities of the Navy. So he was charged with treason and, quote, sitting on foot piratical expeditions. So think about the commerce raiders and the damage that they did to merchant fleets. That's what is kind of laid on Mallory. So there's a great deal of reluctance to release him or to issue him pardon. But if you think about it, this is pretty amazing that these arrests were so brief, that the punishments were so lenient. And why was this? Of course, part of that, I think, has much to do with Abraham Lincoln's vision of what Reconstruction should be. Setting forth the tone of reconciliation, Lincoln declared in his second inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. And then he went on to say, to do all which may achieve a just and lasting peace. Lincoln, in meeting with Grant and Sherman before the fall of Richmond, had instructed them, let them go, officers and all, I want submission and no more bloodshed. And in speaking with General Weitzel after Richmond's fall, he said, if I were in your place, I'd let them up easy, let them up easy. Other factors were at work too, and fatigue was chief among those. And I think you see that there in Lincoln's face. Not only was he fatigued by this struggle, but the war had sapped the strength and emotions of the country. And there was this immense relief that it was finally over. And there was this desire to put it all behind us. Trying and punishing some of the most prominent men in the South would only bring about ill will and deter reconciliation. And additionally, there were legal issues. None of the captured leaders had been instrumental in the original act of secession. None had been present at the founding of the Confederacy. Stevens, in fact, had opposed secession, and neither he nor Davis sought the office they held. And then finally, the U.S. Constitution did not specifically define secession as treason. In fact, it's silent on that. Now, Andrew Johnson continued Lincoln's policy of leniency to the South. And in a way, this is a bit surprising, since Johnson, coming from a very poor family, coming from the lower classes, had a great deal of animosity toward the planter class. But on the other hand, Johnson is a Southerner. He's from Tennessee, and certainly not someone who was in favor of emancipation. So on May 29, 1865, Johnson issued his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. And this proclamation was similar to a previous proclamation issued by Lincoln. Johnson's proclamation offered very broad terms of pardon and provision for amnesty for all who would take the loyalty oath. Now, it did exclude high-ranking military and civil officials, and it also excluded people whose wealth exceeded $20,000. But the people that were excluded could seek pardon. They could personally apply for pardon. So over 15,000 former Confederates applied for pardon, and by September of 1865, pardons were being issued en masse, sometimes as many as 100 a day. And the pardon that is pictured here is actually Trenholm's pardon. By 1866, 7,000 people who had been excluded under the $20,000 rule had received pardons. By May of 1867, Jefferson Davis was the only government leader still in custody. And by this point, Jefferson Davis had become a pawn in the battle between Andrew Johnson, who favored a more lenient Reconstruction, the radical Republicans who wanted harsher measures. However, there was this loud outcry from very prominent Northerners. And because of this, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who favored those harsher measures, really had little choice but to give in and allow Jefferson Davis to be turned over to civilian custody, because up until that point, he was under military control. And being turned over to civilian custody meant he could come to trial. And the feeling among many Northerners, even people who were not sympathetic to the Confederate cause or to Jefferson Davis, was that this is not the American way. It was simply unjust to leave him languishing in prison with no chance to confront his accusers. So Davis's lawyer, Charles O'Connor, was able to secure a writ of habeas corpus that allowed Davis to be remanded to civilian custody. And interestingly enough, that remand hearing took place in Richmond in the very building that had been where Davis had had his executive office. So he has to go back into the building that had been his, or that had housed his presidential office for this hearing. Judge John Underwood presided. This took place on May 13th. And after Davis was turned over, after he was remanded, O'Connor then asked that he be immediately brought to trial. Underwood said he was not prepared to do that at the moment. And then O'Connor asked bail be set for Davis. Bail was set at $100,000. And of course, they had their ducks in a row. They had previously arranged who would put up this bail. It was a total of 18 men, but first and foremost among them were Horace Greeley, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Gerrit Smith. Jefferson Davis never got the trial that he so ardently coveted. On December 5th, 1868, the treason indictment was dismissed under the reasoning that since the 14th Amendment had deprived Davis of the right to hold office, he could not be tried ex post facto. In other words, the 14th Amendment had already punished Davis, and he couldn't be punished again for the same crime. On Christmas Day, 1868, President Johnson issued one final proclamation granting universal, unconditional amnesty to all Confederates. And this is really the news for which Breckinridge had been waiting. He waiting in Canada after being in exile for about 3.5 years. This photograph is a little earlier. He's in Paris there. But Breckinridge returned to the U.S. after that, went back to his native Kentucky, was asked to run for office, but chose not to. But Jefferson Davis, who had gone to Canada after his release and then over to Europe, also returned to the U.S. And it seemed like that this long ordeal was finally over. Now, in examining his, or explaining his reason for posting bail, Gerrit Smith, who, if you're not familiar with him, was an abolitionist, a very strong supporter of John Brown. So this is the type of people putting up this bail for Davis. But Smith, in explaining this, said that he longed for a heart union between North and South. Let our terms of Reconstruction be full of love and generosity as well as justice, and we shall be able to pen the South to us. And this, according to historian David Blight, was really the overwhelming task that was facing America after the Civil War and emancipation. How to understand the tangled relationship between these two profound ideas of healing and justice. And would it have been possible to extend pardon and restoration of rights to former Confederates and at the same time ensure equal rights for African Americans? And this is a big question, and I'm going to end with that because it's the topic of another talk. But that does bring us to a close now.